There are two troubles in Russia: fools.
Had to walk for myself.
Fools with weapons. In Ukraine, 500,000 Russians who came to turn Ukrainians into Russians have already been wiped out because television told them that most people in Ukraine are Russians and that Ukrainians only live on Hoverla and on Bankova Street.
We have every reason to say that in this sense, of course, Ukraine is in a certain way an artificial state created by Stalin's will. We are talking about millions of Russian people, about millions of our compatriots who need our help.
Naturally, this is the ravings of a mad two-headed chicken with schizophrenia in one head and oligophrenia in the other. 80% of Ukraine's residents identify themselves as Ukrainians, even despite the vicious propaganda of the pro-Russian riffraff who for 30 years tried to convince everyone that Ukrainians and Russians are one people.
I think so, yes. Historically, it's been that way. We share the same roots.
Of course, we have many family ties. In my opinion, we share the same roots.
By claiming that there are no Ukrainians in Ukraine, the Kremlin is shamefully trying to hide the fact that millions of ethnic Ukrainians live in Russia itself. In fact, entire regions are Ukrainian both culturally and historically. Kuban is one of them.
I'm Torok myself, that's my last name.
And your first name?
Ivan Denisovich.
What's your passport say?
Russian, per my passport.
And how do you consider yourself?
Who really considers themselves, honestly? We truly do, don't we?
Kuban is such a Ukrainian region that Moscow had to carry out genocide to turn the Ukrainians living there into Russian slaves. The so-called reformatting lasted for more than 100 years.
I came home crying. Dad, what is this, son? How am I Russian? I'm a Cossack. What's the matter? The teacher, well, that's what he said. Well, then we'll be Russian, otherwise they'll wipe us out into the Soviet system and...
As a result, in a region where, at the start of the 20th century, 62% of the population was Ukrainian, by 2010 that had dropped to just 1.5%. Consider the scale of this crime against humanity.
Will the Ukrainian people survive? Of course. But only in Russia?
But just because most residents of Krasnodar Krai have now been convinced that they are Russian, that doesn't make them Russian. People there continue to speak Ukrainian, celebrate holidays according to Ukrainian traditions, and live in settlements with Ukrainian names because they are Ukrainians. And now we will remind them of that.
But 100 years ago, all the residents of Kuban spoke this way. Krasnodar is reviving Balachka, the language of the Kuban Cossacks.
Like a clay pot with a layer of sour cream on top.
Kuban only became part of the Russian quasi-empire at the end of the 18th century. Before that, there wasn't even a trace of Russians here. And even after, Russians were a rarity in these parts because this region was settled and developed by the Zaporizhian Cossacks. After the Russians destroyed the Zaporizhian Sich, Ukrainians began to move en masse to the Kuban and formed the Black Sea host.
On the right bank of the Kuban River, all of this used to be Zaporizhian land. Also,
Ukrainians developed this region, founded cities and settlements, and expanded its borders. Krasnodar was founded by Ukrainians, so it's no surprise that fans of the football club Kuban still make banners in Ukrainian. By the end of the 19th century, according to the 1,897 census, Ukrainians made up the majority of the population in the Kuban. And that's taking into account the old imperial tradition of mass resettlement of bast shoe-wearing Muscovites, officials and nobles to every new region who would move along with their loyal serfs.
Stand up! A second lieutenant is speaking to you!
And still, Ukrainians are the majority. After the collapse of the Russian pseudo-empire in 1917, as expected, the noble clique either moved up into the trees or immigrated. and by 1926, Ukrainians had become the overwhelming majority in the Kuban 62%. There are only 33 Russians.
At that time, my grandfather was still the Ataman, the leader of their group, and they were all Cossacks, people known for their tradition. Then, from over there, some people arrived, and they ended up locking my grandfather inside a barn. So grandfather said, "Cossacks, I never wronged any of you. You were the ones who chose me."
Moscow could neither ignore nor dispute this fact. Kuban is not just land inhabited by Ukrainians, it is Ukraine itself. And this is a historical fact, documented in records. After the First World War, at the Paris Peace Conference in 1918, a map of Ukraine was presented. It included territories that had been densely populated by Ukrainians for centuries. Naturally, Kuban was on that map. It is just as much a Ukrainian region as Kharkiv or Vinnytsia. Moreover, at the beginning of the 20th century, Kuban officially held negotiations about joining the Ukrainian state. For this purpose, on May 28, 1918, a delegation from the Cuban government arrived in Kyiv. They asked for help in fighting the Bolsheviks and discussed unification with their historical homeland. But under pressure from the Don government, the negotiations were disrupted. The Don Cossacks are Cossack collaborators who gladly submitted first to the Tsar, then to the Communists, and now to Putin. But despite everything, Kyiv continued to support Ukrainians in the Kuban. The Ukrainian People's Republic supplied the Kuban Cossacks with 9,700 rifles, 5 million cartridges, and 50,000 shells.
End bell.
Pro-Ukrainian uprisings constantly broke out in the Kuban, against the whites, against the reds, against all the repainted imperialists. In early August 1918, a mass uprising broke out in Taman under the leadership of Colonel Perechatko. The rebels liberated the entire right bank Kuban. Unfortunately, in the war for the independence of Ukraine and its Ukrainian regions, the communists won bloodthirsty, narrow-minded but highly ideological. The Bolsheviks set themselves the goal of melting all the peoples of the USSR into a single Soviet hybrid. This hybrid was supposed to speak Russian and forget all its roots.
Who are these Russians?
Dad, I don't know. We are Russians. Dad is Russian. Why are we Russians? We are Cossacks too. They just reclassified us like that. Already my well, Dad got married. Everyone well, Dad. Mom is a real seasoned Cossack woman.
An unprecedented terror began. Repressions against Ukrainians in the Kuban started almost immediately after the Bolsheviks came to power. At the end of the 1920s, entire villages were deported, such as the Stanitsas of Poltavskaya, Umanskaya, and Medvedovskaya. Even just by their names, you can immediately tell which ethnic group predominated in this region.
Farewell, you beloved and dear Uman Stanitsa. Farewell, beautiful and joyful land.
In 1933, the Holodomor came to the Kuban, just as it did to most of Ukraine. Does anyone still doubt that this was a genocide specifically against the Ukrainian people, since it happened precisely where Ukrainians lived in large numbers? After Moscow starved millions of locals to death, they brought in Russians to settle in their homes.
Tune the accordion. Get ready. Go!
And where were they taken?
To the station in Kazakhstan.
To Kazakhstan.
They deported people in 33 to Kazakhstan north. That's right. Half of our village was deported. And then from the Leningrad region or somewhere, they brought in other people here.
Classic. Right now, the occupiers are doing the same thing in the captured Ukrainian regions: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And of course, in Crimea, where a quiet genocide has been going on for 10 years.
Now, regarding the sleepers, we evicted a large number of families. It was very difficult to do. We evicted those who, in one way or another, did not support the so-called special military operation, those who insulted the flag, the Russian anthem, or the president of the Russian Federation.
The Ukrainians who survived the Holodomor in Kuban immediately fell under the crushing force of the Gulag. The Bolsheviks relentlessly threw all their efforts into systematically destroying the unique Ukrainian identity and culture in order to create an obedient average Russian society, in other words, a faceless mass of conformists and cheerleaders.
They would, in the end, come and take away everything.
They even took things from my father. So on the first night they come, there you go, that's the one. They take him out, he goes over there and right away to the clay pit and they kill him. And they would pick those who were the most disciplined, the best looking.
The Bolsheviks were very afraid of the Ukrainian population because Ukrainians were organized and free. It was they who constantly resisted Moscow's inhuman order, always with weapons in hand. Ukrainians never kept silent and openly stood up against the Kremlin ghouls. But the Kremlin came up with a way to make Ukrainians obedient and passive. They needed to turn them into Russians. As a result, after a century of brutal propaganda, the people of Kuban speaking Ukrainian now call themselves Russians and support the invasion of Ukraine to establish the so-called Russian world there.
So, are you saying this is the Ukrainian language?
God forbid. We speak Kuban dialect. Actually, I don't understand pure Ukrainian at all. We just talk the way we talk. They are so narrow-minded that even the Ukrainian language they speak, they call some kind of dialect. Why hide your forehead with an icon?
What language is that exactly? Well, no. What language were you singing in?
This language is called Balachka. Unfortunately, it is gradually disappearing. Balachka is an original Kuban dialect.
Although not so long ago in Kuban, you could get punched in the face for speaking Russian. Do you know why? Because people who spoke Russian were considered outsiders.
So, are you Russian? Yes. We're from near Voronezh. We were resettled in 1933 to replace those who had died of hunger. So why didn't you teach your daughter your native language? Oh, come on! She couldn't even walk down the street, they beat her mercilessly. It turned out that boys as young as 5, preschoolers, with their tiny fists, forced the children of the resettlers to speak the local dialect.
But propaganda even twisted this obvious fact into Balachka. Calling the Ukrainian language Balachka in Kuban only started in Soviet times and right before the Holodomor. In other words, they planned to kill everyone who remembered that they spoke Ukrainian. That's how desperately they wanted to eradicate everything Ukrainian. After the crucified boy and the Spanish air traffic controller, nothing surprises us anymore.
They took a 3-year-old child, a little boy, in his underwear and a t-shirt, and nailed him to a board like Jesus. One was nailing, 2 were holding him.
Kuban and its people are Ukraine and Ukrainians who became victims of a massive social experiment aimed at erasing a person's self-awareness and self-identity. But everything can be fixed. Kuban must be free, either as an independent state or as part of Ukraine. They are simply too different, both mentally and culturally, from the rest of Russia. And there are no guarantees that Moscow won't want to continue its repressive efforts to reshape the people of Kuban.
Because they suffocated us, for God's sake, because they turned the entire Krasnodar region Russian, Ukrainian.
What are you saying? Now, who have you become?
We don't know ourselves.
Who are you, Russian or...
Turncoats.
That's why it was very timely for the President of Ukraine to issue a decree about historic Ukrainian lands. Yes, yes, you Vatniks! Go drink a mug of Validol. Now, there are truly Ukrainian territories inside Russia. More precisely, they have always been there, and you yourselves opened this Pandora's box.
Today, we must take steps not only to strengthen the unity of Ukraine and our people, but also to unify our rights and freedoms. The truth about Ukrainians, the truth about us, and the truth about our history. For this purpose, today I have signed a decree regarding the historic territories of the Russian Federation populated by Ukrainians.
This news unsettled not only the Kremlin cockroaches, but also the so-called good Russians. Arestovich Squire and Yulia Latinina even put out a post condemning it, because almost all Russians are like that. Liberals Putin supporters, it doesn't matter. They all think they have the right to meddle in other countries, impose their own rules there, and seize land under the pretense of protecting mythical Russians. But when they get a response, they get very offended and ask, what did we do to deserve this? Kuban has never been Russian. The people of Kuban have never been slaves. They just need to truly accept who they are, deep down, and stop being so afraid to honestly admit it to themselves. And then, as a result, the inevitable collapse of the so-called pseudo-empire will happen much, much faster.
If we all as one strike together.
I would like to remind you that this video is created for entertainment purposes and contains elements of satire and irony. All facts and events are presented in a hyperbolized or exaggerated form to convey a comedic or dramatic effect. Our goal is not to mislead, but to highlight humor. Please take it with a smile.